I returned from the retreat to find a strange woman sleeping in my bed. My son said, "Mother, meet my new family. You'll be living at the cabin from now on." I silently turned around, went to the bank, and withdrew my life savings. The next morning they received an eviction notice, but the real blow was yet to come, and it would change everything. Hello to everyone who has joined my story. Please get comfortable. I would be very interested to know which city or country you are listening from. Please write about it in the comments. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Enjoy listening. The train from the Berkshires to New York City moved smoothly, almost lulling. Outside the window, blurred landscapes rushed by, but I was looking not at them, but somewhere deep inside myself, listening to a new, almost forgotten sensation. A feeling of renewal. The air in the mountains had been healing, saturated with pine and cool air, and it seemed I had brought it with me, absorbed it into my lungs, into my very soul. At 82, I felt not just rested, I felt durable. In my hands, I held a small cardboard box tied with twine. Inside was a selection of artisanal chocolates, rich and dark with sea salt. My son Peter's favorite. I had bought them on my last day at a small local market, imagining how he, my grown 54-year-old son, would have them with his evening tea. Such little things. They are the invisible glue that holds a family together. At least I had always believed so. Home. What an all-encompassing word. For me, it was never just walls or square footage on the Upper West Side. It was my fortress, my archive, a place where every object, every book, every scratch on the hardwood floor had its own story, the story of my life. The train clattered rhythmically over the rail joints, and my thoughts carried me far back, to the spring when my Nicholas passed away, and I, a young widow with little Peter, stood at a crossroads. An open road lay before me into a PhD program, into academia. I dreamed of becoming a curator at the Morgan Library, of working with ancient manuscripts, of feeling the dust of centuries under my fingertips. My dissertation topic on pre-revolutionary cartography had already been approved, but on the other side of the scale was Peter. He needed to be fed, clothed, put on his feet. Academia is a long and lean path, and I made a choice without drama, without self-pity. I simply did what a mother had to do. I took a job at the city archives, a modest, stable position. I still got the dust of centuries, but a very different kind, not on ancient maps but in folders with personnel files and decrees. Then my older brother passed away. He left me a decent inheritance for those times. And again I was faced with a choice. I could finally think about myself, buy a smaller co-op, and live on the rest, doing what I found interesting. But I was thinking about the future, about Peter's future. And I invested every penny into this 3-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood, so that my son would have a home, a real solid home that would become his support, and then the support for his children. I was creating a family nest, a bastion that could withstand any storm. Or so I thought. The storm came from an unexpected direction, quietly, like a draft from a poorly closed window. Shortly before my trip to the retreat, Peter and I had a conversation. He came into my room, where a bookshelf that Nicholas had built for me in the early years of our life stands along the entire wall. My pride. Books in old bindings, rare editions that I had collected all my life. Peter surveyed them, and in his eyes I saw no respect, no interest. Only boredom. "Mom," he said then, casually leaning an elbow on a stack of the New York Review of Books from 1975. "Don't be offended, of course, but maybe it's time to get rid of this dusty junk. Nobody reads it anyway. And the wall, look how smooth it is. We could hang a projector screen here. Can you imagine what a chic home theater we could set up? Dusty junk." Those 2 words hit me like a slap. My life, my passion, the memory of my husband, the work to which I had dedicated myself instead of my unfulfilled dream. He called all of it dusty junk. I remember how everything inside me went cold, but I just brushed it off, trying to hide my hurt. I said something like, "When I'm gone, you can set up your movie theater. But for now, this is my study." He laughed, patted me on the shoulder. "Oh, come on, Mom, I'm just kidding." But it wasn't a joke. It was another quiet, imperceptible blow to the foundation of my home. Another crack in the wall of my fortress. I wrote it off to a generational gap, to his eternal striving for something modern new. I forced myself to forget. And now on the train returning home, I felt rested and full of strength. I thought about how I would enter my apartment, how I would breathe in the familiar childhood scent of old books and dried herbs that I always keep in linen sachets. How Peter would be happy about the chocolates. My heart was light, full of anticipation. The taxi stopped in front of my building. I easily, almost youthfully, hopped out of the car, paid the driver, and with my travel bag on my shoulder, entered the familiar semi-darkness. The elevator. The third floor. My door, upholstered in dark brown leatherette. I inserted the key into the lock. Turned with the familiar native click. Home. I stepped over the threshold and immediately knew something was wrong. The air was different. The smell of my books and herbs was mixed with a foreign sharp aroma of cheap perfume. And then I looked down at the doormat in the hallway. Next to Peter's house slipper stood a pair of unfamiliar women's shoes with high, but already scuffed, heels with some tasteless shiny buckle. I froze trying to find an explanation for this. Maybe a colleague of Peter's had come over, or a friend had stopped by to drop something off. But why was it so quiet then? My heart, so light just a moment ago, suddenly became heavy, clenched into a cold lump. I slowly took off my coat, hung it on the rack. The box of chocolates was still in my hands. I walked down the hallway trying to step as quietly as possible, although I didn't understand why myself. The door to my bedroom was ajar. Not Peter's room, mine. A soft light from the nightstand lamp, which I always left on when I was away, fell from the crack. I approached the door and peeked inside. The world stopped. On my bed, under the patchwork quilt that my mother had sewn, a strange woman was sleeping. Her bleached blonde hair was spread out on my pillow. One arm was thrown to the side. She was sleeping deeply, peacefully, in the very heart of my fortress. In the Holy of Holies. I stood and watched, unable to breathe or move. Time froze, turned into a thick jelly. The travel bag slipped from my fingers and silently, as in a silent movie, fell onto the thick wool carpet. And at that moment Peter came out of the kitchen. In his hand was a cup of steaming coffee. He saw me standing in the doorway, and nothing was reflected on his face. No surprise, no shame, no guilt. Only a slight annoyance, as if I had returned at the wrong time and disrupted his plans. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile one gives when delivering unpleasant but inevitable news. "Mom, you're back," he said in an unnaturally cheerful voice. "Perfect timing. I was just about to introduce you. This is Cassandra." He nodded towards my bedroom. "Listen, we've had a wonderful idea. You always say how much you like the cabin. We thought maybe you could finally move there for good. Fresh air, quiet. You'll rest. And Cassandra and I will manage here. It's time for you to really rest." He spoke and I no longer heard him. The sounds of the street outside the window, the ticking of the old clock in the living room, even his voice, it all dissolved, drowned in the deafening silence that had settled inside me. The part of me that should have been screaming, crying, asking questions, demanding explanations, it went numb. It just fell silent forever. All my life I had been laying bricks, strengthening the foundation, patching the cracks. And now I stood and watched as my entire fortress crumbled in an instant. It wasn't just another blow. It was a final, devastating landslide. And there, among the wreckage of my past life, in this ringing void, something began to slowly form. Something very hard, very cold, and absolutely clear. I looked at my son's face, not at the beloved Peter I had once rocked in my arms, but at the face of a 54-year-old man who had just written me out of the catalogue of his own life. There was no malice or cruelty in his eyes. There was only a weary practicality, like that of a person deciding which old furniture to move to the country. And at that moment I understood. This was not a betrayal in the hot Shakespearean sense of the word. It was a cold, clinical statement of fact. I had become an irrelevant object, a piece of decor that no longer fit into the new design. I didn't say a word. My lips were pressed together, but not from resentment, but from extreme concentration. I slowly, very slowly nodded once. It was not a sign of agreement. It was a sign that the information had been received, like an archivist stamping a document that had just come in. My gaze fell to the cardboard box in my hand. The chocolates. A gift for a son who no longer existed. The small, warm symbol of my love now seemed ridiculous and heavy. I turned, just as silently, and walked past the dumbfounded Peter into the kitchen. He muttered something after me, I think. "Mom, what's wrong?" But the sound of his voice was no louder to me than the buzzing of a fly. The kitchen also smelled of a stranger. On the table was a vase of cheap candies, on the stove a frying pan with the remains of scrambled eggs. I went to the trash can under the sink, opened it with my foot, and without untying the twine, dropped the box of treats inside. It fell to the bottom with a dull, papery thud. The case was closed. After that, I turned and walked to the exit. I didn't look back at him, nor at the ajar door of my bedroom, where a strange woman was sleeping in my bed. I just walked, took my coat from the rack, put it on and put on my shoes. Peter was still standing in the hallway with a cup of coffee in his hand, completely bewildered by my silence. He had obviously been expecting tears, reproaches, a scandal. He was ready for it. He probably had answers prepared. But he was not prepared for my icy calm. I turned the key in the lock, opened the door and stepped out onto the landing. The door clicked softly behind me, cutting me off from my past life. The damp city air hit my face, but I barely felt it. I had my own Arctic cold inside me. On the street, I didn't stop. I didn't start wandering aimlessly, wiping away imaginary tears. No, I already had a map in my head. Clear, precise, without a single extra stroke. My steps were firm and purposeful. I was walking to the nearest bank branch. All my life I had been saving money. It was my little secret, my research fund. I always told myself that someday when I retired and Peter was settled, I would spend it on my unfulfilled dream. I would go to Florence, to Rome. I would spend weeks in the archives working with primary sources that I had only seen on microfilm. It wasn't just a rainy day fund. It was a fund for my soul. And now this fund would be used for another expedition, to reclaim my own life. The bank was warm and quiet. A young teller with a polite smile asked how she could help. I handed her my savings passbook. "Hello." My voice sounded even and calm. Not a single muscle in my face twitched. "I would like to withdraw the entire amount from my account in cash." The girl's eyebrows shot up in surprise when she saw the balance. The sum was significant. 50 years of a modest life, 50 years of deferred desires and saved bonuses. The entire amount, Mrs. Chandler? Perhaps a transfer would be better? It's not safe. The entire amount in cash, I repeated, looking her straight in the eye. My gaze left no room for further persuasion. She shrugged and began to process the documents. While the machine was whirring, counting the bills, I sat up straight, staring at one point. I wasn't thinking about Peter. I was thinking that a deferred dream is also an asset. And sometimes it has to be liquidated to cover emergency expenses. Half an hour later, I left the bank with a heavy envelope in the inner pocket of my coat. The money didn't warm me. It was just a tool, cold and effective. I went into a small, nameless coffee shop, ordered a cup of black tea, and sat at a table by the window. I took out my phone, my only true ally in this world. Isabel, my great-niece, the daughter of my late niece, a smart, sharp girl with the character of an investigator. She was studying journalism at Columbia and adored me, as she said, for my intellectual honesty. I dialed her number. "Izzy, hello, my dear." "Aunt Evelyn, hi. Are you back already? How was the retreat?" "It was excellent. Thank you." My voice was still even. "Izzy, I need your help. It seems I've been written off the balance sheet of my own home." There was a silence on the line for a few seconds. "What?" Her voice became tense. "Aunt Evelyn, I don't understand. What happened?" And I told her. Without emotion, without complaints, listing the facts as in an archival inventory. I arrived, saw the shoes, the woman in my bed, Peter's words about the cabin. When I finished, Izzy was silent for another moment, And then her voice rang with fury. That parasite, she hissed. How dare he? Aunt Evelyn, that apartment is not his asset. It's your life. Yours. You are the head of the family, the matriarch, not an old dresser that can be moved to the country. Whatever you need, I'm here. I'm coming right now, we'll fix them. We'll fix this. I took a sip of hot tea. Its warmth briefly touched my lips but did not penetrate inside. Calm down, my dear, I said quietly. Anger is a poorly indexed document. It leads nowhere, only creates chaos. I don't need fury right now. I need the clarity of an archivist. I explained my plan to her, or rather, its first part. Izzy quickly pulled herself together. Her journalistic instincts outweighed her emotions. Got it, she said, her voice now businesslike. Digital reconnaissance. We have this Cassandra's name. I'll start digging. Good, I replied. And I'll take care of the paperwork. That same day, I was in a respectable office building not far from the center. I had an appointment with a lawyer whom an old acquaintance had recommended to me many years ago. Tough, businesslike, no sentimentality, but he knows the law like the back of his hand. Exactly what I needed. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a sharp, appraising gaze, sat me in a leather armchair opposite his heavy oak desk. I'm listening, Mrs. Chandler. I didn't tell him about a broken heart or a son's ingratitude. I stated the case in legal terms. There is a real estate object, a 3-bedroom apartment. I am the sole and rightful owner on the basis of a purchase and sale agreement and a certificate of inheritance. My son, Peter Chandler, born in 1968, is registered in the apartment. At the moment, he is preventing my access to my own home, having settled third parties there without my knowledge and consent. My demand is to ensure the eviction of all unauthorized persons and Peter Chandler himself from my apartment in the shortest possible time established by law. As I spoke, I took a thick envelope out of my bag and placed it on the table. This is an advance for your services. At the moment my hand released the envelope, a vivid image like a slide flashed in my memory. I am 27. I am standing at the mailbox holding a similar envelope, only a thin one. In it is a letter from the university. I have been accepted into the graduate program. The paper smells of printer's ink and happiness. And that same evening, little Peter gets a fever. He is lying in his crib, hot, weak, looking at me with big, frightened eyes, and I understand that I have no right to risk his stability, his future, for my dream. The next day, I wrote a letter of refusal and went to get a job at the archives. The money I was now paying the lawyer was the fruit of that very decision, a direct consequence of that sacrifice. The irony was so bitter that a metallic taste appeared on my lips. The lawyer moved the envelope towards him without looking inside. He looked at me with undisguised interest, even a touch of respect. Clarity is the best weapon in such cases, Mrs. Chandler, he said. You impress me with your composure. Don't worry. The law is entirely on your side. We will make the first move immediately. He looked at his watch. The eviction notice will be delivered to your son by courier tomorrow at 9 in the morning. The next morning I met Izzy not in my apartment, but in a small cafe on a quiet street. I was staying with her. Her tiny studio under the very roof of an old brownstone had become my refuge and headquarters for a few days. The city was waking up outside the window, and we sat at a table, drinking coffee and silently watching the hustle and bustle. I didn't feel homeless. I felt like a general, observing the battlefield from a calm, safe hill. At exactly 9:05, my phone vibrated on the table. I glanced at the screen. Peter. I wasn't surprised. I was expecting it. Izzy tensed. Her gaze became sharp, ready to defend. I gestured to her that everything was fine. I took a small, unhurried sip of hot coffee, enjoying its bitterness, and only then did I answer the call, putting it on speaker. The silence of the cafe was shattered by his voice. It wasn't even a speech, but a jumbled, ragged stream of sounds, a mixture of panic, poorly concealed threats, and a completely childish resentment. Mom, what have you done? Are you crazy? A courier brought me some paper. Eviction? What eviction? You can't throw me out on the street. Me, your son with a child. This is my home. I listened patiently without interrupting, letting him vent the first murkiest wave of panic. When he fell silent to catch his breath, I answered. My voice sounded so calm that it seemed to belong to another person. No, let's correct the record, Peter. This was never your home. It was my property where you were a long-term tenant. Your right to live there was conditioned by our family relationship, which you yourself terminated with your own statement the day before yesterday. The case on that relationship is closed, and your new obligations are a completely separate account, and it does not concern me. A stunned silence hung on the other end. My words, dry and emotionless, like an extract from a registry, did not fit into his worldview. He had expected screams, tears, mutual accusations. He was not ready for a protocol. What case? He stammered. Mom, come to your senses. You have a duty. You are a grandmother. You have to think about your grandson. The ice in my chest became even denser. I placed the cup on the saucer. The sound of porcelain on porcelain seemed deafeningly loud in the ensuing pause. What grandson are you talking about, Peter? I asked, and in my voice it seemed there was not a drop of warmth left. My only biological grandson, Kostya, lives in Seattle with his mother, your first wife, whom you abandoned in the same way many years ago. You haven't seen him in 5 years. This child you are talking about is not my blood, and not my responsibility. He gasped for air. This argument was irrefutable. It was the truth that he himself had been carefully pushing into the farthest drawer of his consciousness for many years. But he's a child. There was desperation in his voice. Cassandra. Apparently, the woman standing next to him realized that he was losing the battle. There was some commotion on the line, and then another voice was heard. A woman's, with carefully calibrated notes of righteous indignation. Mrs. Chandler, it's Cassandra. How can you be so shameless? You are an elderly woman, you should be wiser. To throw your own son out on the street with his family. We only wished you well, to send you to the cabin so you could rest. And you. She said something else about conscience, about humanity, about how God sees everything. I listened to her with a detached curiosity. It was a bad, clumsy attempt at manipulation, calculated on a sense of guilt that I no longer had. She was addressing the Mrs. Chandler whom she and Peter had killed yesterday in the hallway of my apartment. But that woman no longer existed. I didn't answer her. I just pressed the end call button. Izzy looked at me with wide-open eyes, in which shock and admiration were mixed. Grandma, she whispered, you just hung up. Why continue that conversation? Izzy, I answered calmly, picking up my cup again. It wasn't a conversation. It was an attempt at emotional blackmail. You don't negotiate with blackmailers. You ignore them. The first warning shot had been fired. Now we had to wait. A few days passed, days of a strange echoing silence. Peter didn't call again. Apparently, they decided that these were just empty threats, that I would cool down and everything would go back to normal. I spent this time putting my thoughts and archives in order. I went to that same cabin where they had so kindly sent me. A dilapidated little house, an overgrown garden. But now, in the silence of the autumn day, it didn't seem like a prison to me. It seemed just a neglected plot of land that needed work. I walked around it, noted that the porch needed to be repaired, the apple trees pruned. For the first time in many years, I looked at it not as a place of exile, but as another of my assets. And then, on the 5th day, Izzy called again. This time her voice sounded different. Not just angry but grim and victorious. The way people talk when they have dug up a terrible but very important truth. Grandma, I found her. I froze with the book in my hands. Are you sure? Absolutely. There was metal in her voice. Cassandra Miller is an alias. One of many. Her real name is Marina Petrova. 43 years old, originally from a small town in the Midwest. And most interestingly, she has 2 previous convictions, both for fraud on a particularly large scale. Izzy paused, letting me process what I had heard. The scheme is the same. She finds a lonely, well-off older man who has real estate and elderly parents. She worms her way into his confidence, creates the illusion of a ready-made family with the help of her son, plays on pity, on the need to build a nest. The goal? An apartment. She's done it before, Grandma. Twice. And both times she almost succeeded. I was silent, looking out the window at the gray city roofs. I felt no surprise, no joy that my worst suspicions had been confirmed. I felt only a cold, heavy rightness and the understanding that eviction was not a punishment, but a salvation for my foolish son. A salvation he did not deserve, but which, strangely enough, I was obliged to provide him. The preliminary earthquake was over. Now the real main blow was being prepared. And I knew that I had to deliver it myself, personally, documentarily, finally closing this case in my life's archive. My lawyer arranged a meeting in his office under the pretext of discussing the terms of a settlement agreement. It was a necessary formality, a bait that Peter, as I had expected, immediately swallowed. He was sure that I, having made a scene for propriety's sake, was now ready to bargain. Izzy and I arrived early. I was sitting in the same leather armchair as on my first visit, but I felt completely different. Then I was a person who had lost her home. Now I was a person who had come to collect the keys. On the polished table in front of me lay a thick gray cardboard folder, tied with ribbons. Izzy had compiled it with the meticulousness of the best criminalist. Every document, every printout, every line was in its place. It was not just compromising material, it was an epilogue. They entered exactly at the appointed time. Peter looked gaunt but held himself with a defiant bravado. He was clearly preparing for a difficult conversation, for a bargain over meters and money. Cassandra, on the contrary, looked impeccable. A perfect hairstyle, a strict but expensive suit, a light, confident smile on her lips. She had come to play the role of a businesslike, aggrieved party who had been slandered by a crazy old woman. She sat next to Peter, placed her elegant handbag next to her, and prepared for the performance. The lawyer said a few formal phrases about the purpose of our meeting. I wasn't listening to him. I was looking only at Peter, at his face, on which an impatient expectation of my surrender was still written. When the lawyer finished, I didn't say a word. I just took the folder and slowly, without a single extra movement, pushed it across the smooth surface of the table to my son. He looked at me in confusion, then at the folder. Cassandra threw a short, disdainful glance at it. "What is it?" Peter asked. "Mom, if you think some of your complaints." "Open it," my lawyer said in a quiet but weighty voice. Peter untied the ribbons with irritation and opened the folder. On top was a photocopy of a passport in the name of Marina Petrova, with a photograph of the woman sitting next to him. I saw him frown, not understanding. Then his gaze slid down to the next page. It was a printout from a database of criminal records. Article 159, Part 4. Fraud. And at that moment, a terrible silent transformation began. The pink, slightly weathered color of his face began to slowly fade, giving way to an unhealthy pallor. He turned the page. There were copies of court decisions. The next page was the testimony of a man from a nearby town who had almost lost his apartment. Another page was a heart-wrenching letter from a woman whose father had ended up in the hospital with a heart attack after a similar story. Izzy had found them all. He leafed through page after page, and his face became first white as the paper on which all this was printed, and then it acquired an earthy, grayish-ashen hue. His hands began to tremble finally. He looked up at Cassandra/Marina. In his gaze was no longer anger, but an animal primal terror of a person who has realized that all this time he has been living in the same den with a predator, mistaking it for a domestic cat. Cassandra wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the folder. One glance at the contents was enough for her. She was a professional. She knew when the game was over. There were no screams, no excuses, no tears. She just stood up, took her handbag, adjusted the lapel of her jacket, and without a word, without honoring Peter with even a farewell glance, turned and walked out of the office. The sharp click of her heels in the corridor grew quieter and soon faded completely. The new family had evaporated, dissolved into thin air, turning out to be a cheap, vulgar illusion. Peter was left sitting. He looked at the door behind which she had disappeared. Then his gaze returned to the folder. He was broken. Completely, finally, to the very foundation. In one moment he had lost everything. His home, his future hope of an inheritance, the woman he thought he loved. But most importantly, he had lost his dignity. He had been made a fool of, a pathetic, gullible fool, deceived by the most banal con artist. And the one who had exposed him was the very mother whom he had so carelessly tried to write off. I stood up. Izzy also rose. We left him there, in that expensive office, alone with his shame and a gray cardboard folder containing the obituary of his failed life. The apartment met me with silence. It was empty and clean, but it was no longer my fortress. The ghosts of lies and betrayal had settled in these walls, and I knew that I would never be able to get rid of them. The smell of a stranger's perfume seemed to have permanently soaked into the wallpaper, and the image of the woman in my bed stood before my eyes whenever I entered the bedroom. This place had ceased to be my sanctuary. It had become a crime scene. With the same calm, cold decision with which I had once entered the bank, I called a realtor. A month later, the apartment was sold. What happened to Peter? I only heard in distant, muffled rumors. I knew that he had been forced to move out. He had rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment somewhere on the outskirts, in a rough neighborhood. His life had shrunk, diminished to the size of his character. I didn't feel sorry for him. I didn't feel any gloating either. I felt nothing. The archival file titled Peter was closed and sent to permanent storage without the right of access. My own story was just beginning. With the money from the sale of the apartment and my untouched research fund, I went to the local library, the very one I used to run to as a girl. I found the director, an energetic woman my age, and laid out my idea to her. And so now I am standing here, in a bright sunlit room in the basement of the library. It smells of fresh wood, book glue, and a little of printer's ink. Around me are several teenagers, bent over tables. We have equipped a real bookbinding workshop here, free for anyone who wants to learn how to give books a second life. I am showing a thin girl with burning eyes how to properly sew a book block, how to carefully glue the end band. Her fingers are still clumsy, but there is so much focused delight in her gaze that I can't help but smile. At some point I'd take a break, go to my desk, take an old but beloved thermos, and pour a cup of tea into the lid. Not a simple tea, not a tea bag from a box, but an expensive large-leaf tea with bergamot and cornflower petals. The very kind I had always considered an unaffordable luxury. I take a slow, deliberate sip. The fragrant steam warms my face. I look at these young, enthusiastic faces, at their diligent hands, at the stacks of old books waiting their turn. And for the first time in many, many years, I feel not just calm. I feel a deep, all-encompassing peace. This quiet, warm joy that I now feel with my whole being became possible for only one reason. Because on that terrible day, I did not cry. I did not beg. I found the strength to take what was mine and to close the door on the past. For many years, I had carefully preserved other people's stories, rebinding yellowed pages. Now I had finally become the author of my own. Thank you for being with me until the very end. If this story touched you, please give it a like and write in the comments if you have had to deal with similar betrayal, and how you found the strength to move on. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Be healthy, value yourself, and live truly.